All right, welcome to Halitics. I'm Hal Ginsberg, and over the past few days and weeks, I've been spending an awful lot of time talking about Israel-Palestine. That's not going to change. It's going to continue today, tomorrow as well, with Medea Benjamin from Code Pink. It was great to talk to Arlen yesterday. Having John call in as well was an added bonus, and we did focus quite a bit on Israel-Palestine. Also touched on some other topics. To get today, again, the primary discussion will be what I have to call, and I don't want to, but I think it really is the right word. I don't know another term besides genocide, the targeted killing of a mass group of people based on their ethnicity. This does appear to be what Israel is doing to Gaza. I don't know any other explanation. Clearly, the concept of collective guilt is being applied, much as the Christians who persecuted Jews for a millennium or more in Europe blamed the Jewish people for the death of Christ. Every Jew was guilty. So it appears that Israel is taking out vengeance, wreaking its, bloodthirsty revenge against the people of Gaza for what some Hamas terrorists did. There's no other way to view this but just attack based on membership in an ethnic group, based on geography. And 10,000 dead now, maybe. Something like that. There's certainly no moral equivalency here. There's nothing except murderous rampage by Israel. And I'm not happy to say it. I don't feel good about it. In fact, I'm profoundly depressed. I will play a video from Dr. Gabor Mate. I believe, I could be wrong, I believe he's either a psychologist or psychiatrist. I mentioned yesterday that one of the few people that I really do believe is extremely credible and almost never gets it wrong is Gabor Mate's son, Aaron Mate. I'm going to play this long-form interview from the program, the live stream, the podcast that Aaron Mate does with Max Blumenthal, The Gray Zone, where they interview or really just listen to Dr. Mate. I think it's worth platforming Dr. Mate at this point. I think his perspective is so important that we must give it to you. We must fully hear from him without I can't say without interruption. I will interrupt. You can also find this online at the Gray Zone, so it's not like you can't hear it. But I will, at a few points, I will comment, also show some images as well, if I'm able to do that. But let's get to this conversation, or really it's more just the profound thoughts and sadness. I mean, the sadness that he feels, that I feel, we're Jewish, to see what the Jewish state is doing and the failure to condemn their actions, both by our fellow Jews, but also by so many others, calls into question our collective humanity.
Welcome, Dad.
Welcome.
Hi, how you guys? It's one of those situations where somebody who deals with trauma in my work and who speaks so much, and words really are my métier, the words fail me at this point. It's difficult to explain how I perceive the situation, but in a certain deep sense, I feel that it's the worst thing I've seen in my whole life. And it's impossible to compare atrocities. I mean, nothing compares with the mechanized murder of 5-6 million Jews by the Nazis. What can compare to the slaughter of 3 million Vietnamese civilians by the Americans? The many murders and mass killings that are not even reported in the Western press, such as the Indonesian genocide in East Timor, such as the killing of 100,000 Guatemalan indigenous people in the 1990s by the American and Israeli trained brutal military in that country. One could go on. But what is different about this is that I've never seen anything so publicly committed, such atrocities perpetrated on television, and the victims are presented as the perpetrators. And either this spectacle, this obscene, vicious spectacle that we're subjected to, is either supported or condoned by the major media and all the politicians. Now, it's obligatory, and I think it's even necessary to say, this is my point of view, is that what happened on October 7th wasn't justifiable, that the killings of civilians, whatever details may yet emerge about intentions or what actually happened, that's not something that should have happened. That was something horrible, and it was an atrocity. But even the need to say that comes out of a culture in which the atrocities of the other side are never called out. No Israeli spokesman, when they talk about their policies, ever asked, do you condemn the pogrom at Hawara in the West Bank earlier?
Yeah, I just want to stop it there because this is a really important point that Dr. Mate is making here about how the Palestinians and those of us who criticize Israel for its response, for its bloodthirsty revenge against the Palestinians, how we are constantly being called upon to condemn what Israel did. I'm sorry, please take that. No, we are constantly being called on to condemn what Hamas did. And yet, the Israelis when is there ever a demand that they take responsibility or condemn what the Jewish settlers in the West Bank are doing, what, the thousands and thousands of deaths of Hamas, of Palestinians in Gaza over the past 20 years? Those are never, there's no requirement that those who are, critical of the Palestinians, there's never demand on them to condemn Israel. And yet when Hamas, which doesn't have any kind of democratic claim to represent the Palestinian people or the people of Gaza, does commit a terrorist act, which is frankly understandable, which is frankly something that should have been expected and apparently may well have even been allowed to happen. That's what some are saying. And given the fact that Hamas was getting money, according to Nick Kristof of the New York Times, that was approved by Netanyahu, it does seem plausible that this terrorist attack by Hamas was allowed to happen. So Hamas acted in a way that Israel had to foresee. The response by the representative government of Israel has been mass murder, has been slaughter against an oppressed people. And yet those of us who say, no, this is wrong, Israel should not do this, this is murder, this is genocide, those of us who say that, like myself and Dr. Mate and many, many others, obviously, there's demands on us. Well, you have to condemn Hamas too. You have to condemn Hamas too, as though somehow what Israel is doing has to be viewed in the context of Hamas's actions, and that it's somehow a legitimate response. And yet, the opposite is true. What Hamas did is far more understandable and to a degree justifiable by Israel's actions over the past 20 plus years in Gaza, the West Bank, and against Palestine generally. All right, let's get back to Mate, but I think it's really critical that it be understood that there's an enormous double standard. Anyone who condemns Israel's retaliatory acts has to repudiate Hamas. But Israeli supporters, all they have to do is say, I stand with Israel, as though that justifies, as though they're, okay, well, if you stand with Israel, then it's fine for them to kill 10,000 people.
This year, do you condemn the killings of Palestinian children by settlers? Do you condemn the regular attacks by the settlers? Do you understand that the former deputy chief of staff of the Israeli army said that the situation of the Palestinians in the West Bank reminds him of the situation of Jews in Germany? Is this even reported in the Western press? And what he meant by is that the settlers, like the Nazi hooligans, are free to attack the Palestinians as the Nazis, thugs, the brown shirts were free to attack Jews, and the army and the police not only stood by, they aided and abetted them. Is the Western public made aware of the thousands of Jewish Israeli rabbis and historians and intellectuals who recently signed a document calling the present situation clearly apartheid? Are you aware that the former head of Mossad has said that the situation of the Palestinians under the occupation is apartheid? And so when anybody is asked to speak about perpetrations on the Palestinian side, they're immediately asked to condemn and to denounce and to reject. And yet the daily suffering, crucifixion of the Palestinian people, and including and especially the people in Gaza, nobody's ever called to task. Nobody's ever questioned. And these smooth-faced liars in the Israeli army who would give lessons to Goebbels, Joseph Goebbels, who are masters of propaganda, like Goebbels never was. They're allowed to get away with it. Now, I'm speaking emotionally now. It's not helpful sometimes to speak emotionally because people get repelled by the anger or by the outrage that one generates. I understand the grief on both sides. I understand the sorrow. I've had communication from Israeli friends who are actually sympathetic to the Palestinian side, who are just in fear, who are full of thoughts of revenge. I get that, I understand it. But surely in this situation, whoever you are, whichever side you're on, you got to get past your feelings. You can understand your feelings, you can accept them, but you owe, if you want truth, and if you want peace, and if you want justice, you can't just go by feelings that are conditioned by decades of propaganda, decades of weaponizing the suffering of Jews as a baton with which to beat the Palestinians. You got to get past.
Yeah, I want to stop that for a second. That is so accurate. I can say as a Jewish person, this is, and not even from my family, because they have been pretty darn liberal, I think, and more so than most when it comes to taking ownership or criticizing Israel and criticizing the Jews of Israel for oppressing Palestinians. But there's always in the background, I hear this so often, we're, one step away from the ovens. It could happen again. They want to destroy us. They want to kill us. And this is always a trope among the Jewish community. Yes, Israel maybe is going too far. Yes, maybe they shouldn't have done that. Maybe the settlements need to stop. But my God, we're always under attack. We're always being subject to pogroms and mass murder and the Holocaust. So what else can we do? That's sort of the attitude and this victimhood that it seems to permeate so many Jewish people, the sense that they are victims, even though now in America and around the world, we're probably the most privileged ethnic group, the most privileged religion in the world with the most influence per person, per capita. And yet we can't see ourselves in a way as anything but victims. So, maybe Netanyahu shouldn't be killing those thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of children and parents and grandparents who had nothing to do with the attacks. Maybe he shouldn't have done that, but we can't break our solidarity. We have to stand together. Well, I do see myself as a Jew, but I see myself as a human being who is on the side of the oppressed and the persecuted. And the people who are oppressed and persecuted are the people that are being, who are rounded up and put in a tiny little sliver of land between the desert and the sea, where they're constantly being persecuted and oppressed and kept in dire poverty. So I cannot take the side of Israel. I cannot forgive what Israel is doing. I cannot see Israel as anything but the war criminal that Dr. Mate is describing, and I believe completely accurately. All right, let's hear more from him.
That. And you have to actually ask yourself, do I really know what's going on? Have I stood 1 second even in my mind in the shoes of the other? Have I tried to understand what's happening to those people? If they committed certain acts that are hateful, what drove them to that hate? Did the Palestinians come to Europe to attack Jews? Or did something happen in their land that made them so desperate? And finally, I'll only say that what happened there is not a secret. It's been documented. It's been written up by Israeli historians. I could name 5 of them right off the bat. Tom Segev, Simha Flapan, Ilan Pape, many others by Israeli journalists. None of this is even vaguely controversial from the historical point of view. And the fact that we live in such a bubble, and this bubble is created by the same Western press that brought us the Iraq War and the weapons of mass destruction, and yes, the Kuwaiti incubator children, leading to the death of 500,000 Iraqi civilians. The same Western press that brought us the Vietnam War. When Martin Luther King spoke out against the Vietnam War, do you remember what the New York Times said? New York Times said, this time he crossed over the line. It's that same press. You might want to ask yourself, why are there so either passive or enthusiastic cheerleaders for this genocide? Are you really going to trust them? Are you going to try and find out for yourself? So, yes, I'm speaking with a lot of emotion now. I did give it into you, an extensive one, a longer one, not so emotionally laden as these words have been now. But in light of the latest news from Gaza with apparently the cell phones and internet being cut off and the bombing.
Yeah, that is a big deal, right? I mean, let's isolate these people completely. Let's take away their ability to communicate with the outside world. And only after pressure from, and the only time we've really applied any pressure, any criticism really of what Israel's doing. I mean, there have been a few warnings, don't go overboard, as though Israel hasn't completely gone overboard. And that, language, Mate said here, words are his métier, and yet, and I've said this too, words fail you at this kind of atrocity. He said this is the worst thing he's ever seen. And he talked about maybe one of the, right there. And I think the more people were, obviously the Holocaust was 6 million dead Jews, and then others killed as well. Gypsies also basically there was an attempt to wipe them off the face of the planet. But it seems as though And it's true, the world was largely silent. But here, it's almost as though the world is cheering Israel on to a great degree. One of the criticisms that I've heard about me is I'm too willing to buy or accept media, the media when it criticizes Israel, and I'm not accepting the, I have a sort of I don't understand the history of it somehow, of this conflict, of this. Conflict is way too generous a word. I mean, it's the Kansas City Chiefs beating up on, crushing without any mercy, a junior high school JV team, basically. So, but with guns and bombs. The idea somehow that if you take the Palestinian side, if you say this is what Israel's doing is absolutely fundamentally wrong, it's atrocious, it's a war crime, it's genocide. The idea that if you say what Israel is doing is wrong, you're somehow mistaken, you're misguided, you've been fooled, seems so odd to me because the media is so completely siding with Israel, bending over backwards to make excuses and apologies and trying to understand her actions. So how anyone could say, well, that's being, you're ignorant of the history is so odd, because all the media does is try to explain and justify and excuse Israel, make apologies for Israel. Tomorrow we'll have Medea on from Code Pink, so we'll talk about ways to stand against what Israel's doing, to stand against this genocide. I think that's really important. I did put a link to the march that's this Saturday in DC. I hope you'll join me. I'll be there. If you see me, please, you know who I am because you can see me right now. Come over and say hi. I'd love to talk to you. Let me play some more from Mate. He really, provides the range of emotions for me that I've been feeling, although I think more powerfully. Okay, back to...
And the bombings being escalated. You know what? I'm upset. I'm really upset. I have a lot of feelings of pain. I know what happened to my own people. Nothing that happened to us in any way justifies what's going on right now.
All right, so I'm going to stop him there. There is more to that. It's really powerful. I urge you to check out Gabor Mate on the Gray Zone and watch the entire video. It's incredibly powerful. It's incredibly important. A lot of what he said I'm going to touch back on, though. So he says you have to sometimes be careful about your emotions, right? You can't let them overcome you or kind of cloud your reasoning. But sometimes you do. Sometimes things are so bad and so wrong and so painful and cruel that I think an emotional response is the honest one, is the rational one. We can't lose sight of our humanity and become robots who simply react with an analytic response to what's happening. I mean, I think the pain, the tears, that shows that we're human. We're not sociopathic. So yes, sometimes you do let emotions come to the surface. And when people try to excuse or make allowances for Israel, I do get angry. I do get upset. I'm not, you may not be able to persuade people when you're yelling or when you choke up. I get that, but there are times when persuasion isn't going to work anyway. If you don't get how totally wrong what Israel is doing now, I don't know how to ever persuade you. Just as if you don't get that we're burning our planet up and that we've created the new Holocaust, I don't know what to tell you. I don't know what I can possibly say. So, from the New York Times, thousands of Palestinians already dead has begun a ground assault, and they are hiding as best they can from the world so much of what they're. This is what is happening right now. This is where we are right now. And we are supporting this. Our military supports this. Our government supports this unequivocally, without any reservations. We are behind this. We are providing arms, aid, money to Israel, to the killers, to the mass murderers of Gaza, to the genocide of Gaza. We are complicit in that. And I think that's where Mate was going when he said this is the worst thing I've seen. Because we as a nation, we as a people, there was so much opposition. And it grew more and more to the Vietnam War. President Johnson, who escalated, realized it was wrong. When Nixon started bombing Cambodia, and Mate references the 3 million Cambodians who were killed, there were protests in the street. Although he also notes that the New York Times wouldn't support Dr. King when he came out as a pro-peace advocate. So the history of liberals, the history of Democrats is replete with instances where we have supported, we have backed murderers, killers, death, empire. And that is what is happening right now. There seems to be a moral failing in our nation. This article from two big shots, I guess, I'm not even sure who exactly they are. I got to a point where I just, was like, okay, what did you say? I don't really care who you are exactly, but they present themselves here as the as representatives of two of our most elite institutions. This was in yesterday's New York Times. Definitely caught my eye. The discourse is toxic. Universities can help. And yes, when people are dying, I've left that image up there on the top right of the screen for a while. I'll swap it out in a moment. But yes, when people are dying, are being murdered, then yes, the topic, the discussion gets toxic. It is true. It's very, very hard not to condemn people who don't condemn what's happening, right? It's very hard. I get they may have their reasons, but in the face of this, it's very hard not to get angry and to have a conversation that really is not conversation. It is toxic. This is what happened. I don't think the professors here who are featured in the New York Times come close to addressing the situation. Let's get into and I think this is exactly what Mate is talking about. So let me show them. This is where they start. Condemnation of the October 7 massacre of Israeli civilians by Hamas and calling it as an act of terrorism shouldn't be avoided out of risk of offending Palestinian support. See, to me, again, you're getting it wrong. And this is exactly what Mate said. Sure, of course, killing innocent people is wrong. But Israel is the oppressor nation. The people who were killed are citizens of Israel. They do have some agency over their government, which is immoral, which is in a very real sense evil, and which has now shown itself bearing its fangs as genocidal. This is not where you start. The Hamas terrorists were acting, I agree, wrongly, immorally. But what are they supposed to do? What would you prefer that might work, that would help them gain freedom for their people? This is not where you start. You start with Israel's been oppressing and persecuting Palestine, and it has responded to an attack by the oppressed with an orgy of violence. And the attack on all humanity is what Israel is doing to Gaza and Palestine. That's where they should start, these professors. You've already lost me and so many others. They don't completely excuse. I mean, this is one of those reasonable responses we talked about. We saw this from AOC, and I'm going to play that video because, again, she completely fails to address the moral catastrophe, the moral failing, the failure, the soullessness of what Israel is doing. So these professors, one of them is Jewish, I guess Israeli, the other Palestinian, from Princeton and Columbia, note, a discussion of the actions that states should take in self-defense is worth convening. Israel's response should be directed at eliminating the threat posed by Hamas, not at innocent civilians in Gaza. What that means in practice is a matter for debate. Okay, I agree with you. I agree with that. But there's no debate that targeting civilians, invading Gaza, turning the country into rubble, is not in any way, under any circumstances, okay. It's clearly a crime. That's a crime against humanity. That is the crime against humanity. I agree that we should be talking about what would work, what is the appropriate response. How do we eliminate the threat to innocent people? And there is a way. It's not really that tough to come up with. The way you eliminate the threat is you take your foot off the throat of the people who you're oppressing, who you're persecuting. You take away their raison for being so angry, for hating you, for wanting to kill you, for being willing to do anything to stop you. That's what you do. You don't bomb. You don't launch missiles. You don't send in tanks. You don't kill children. That's, if you really care about your own lives, then that's what you do. You stop the oppression, the persecution, the killing. That's what you do. That's the solution. So even if, unlike me, you don't really care about the lives of Palestinians, you only care about being safe. If that's your only motivation, guess what? You should still do the right thing. If you said to the Southerners before the Civil War, what's the best way to avoid losing, 300,000 people in the bloodiest war this country's ever experienced and will have experienced 175 years later? What's the best way to avoid that? Even I know you don't care about those black people you've enslaved. I know their lives mean less than nil to you, except to the extent that they generate, except that they're almost free labor. But guess what? If you don't want to die yourself in a bloody conflict, set them free. Just do it. I mean, it is the right thing, but even if you don't care about doing what's right, set them free. And so that's what I say to Israel. Welcome Gazans, welcome Palestinians as full members of Israel, as full citizens. Guarantee them economic security and safety. Maybe you couldn't care, they're to you less than human. But it's not only the right thing to do, which apparently you don't care about, it's also the best thing for you to do. For you. For your well-being, for your children. That's the best thing. Palestine has no. These people are left completely alone. Both parties don't care. They just don't. New House Speaker Mike Johnson said Sunday that aid to Israel, it's so important that we help the oppressive state here, that it's got to be just standalone. We're not gonna risk any chatter about Ukraine or whether we should be providing aid against Russia to maintain that endless war. We're not even going to bother with that because we've just got to get this to Israel right away as they launch a murderous rampage against a virtually defenseless group of people. So the Republicans, nothing. Even Marjorie Taylor Greene, she will not take the side of the Palestinians. Not that I would even say she took the side of Russia against Ukraine or the side of civilians against Ukraine, but she did recognize, she acknowledged the wrongness of our support for the war in Ukraine. No Republican has spoken out against Israel, and neither has really any Democrat. And if you want to say, well, some of their language is kind of mealy-mouthed and they're not 100% behind Israel, not one's calling for a ceasefire. They all voted for AIPAC's best friend, AIPAC's bestie there, Hakeem Jeffries. They all voted, every last one of them. So I want to play this again because this really did sicken me, and I was heartened when CG yesterday said she agreed with me. Jay is yes. Thank you, Jay. I'll take your calls if you want to join me. 240-363-7190. 240-363-7190. Here's AOC. This was just such a complete she just completely abrogated her responsibility to speak truth to power. She always, isn't that what she was? Why we elected her? Why we supported her in the first place? And yet she seems incapable of calling out just pure evil when it's right in front of her face.
First things to be said is that there is no way to discuss the conflict with Israel and Palestine without making someone extremely angry. And the idea that 2.2 million people must starve and be exposed to diseases of water and more, the idea that should happen in order to, as punishment for Hamas is wrong. I must also say that Hamas's hostage taking also constitutes a war crime. And what we saw on the 7th of October was an attack that was an affront to humanity.
Yeah, so she has to focus again there on Hamas. The attack on humanity is by Hamas. That's the war crime, not what Israel's doing. By the way, if you're hearing some noise in the background, I'm trying so hard to get rid of it, but we're having some work done here at my house, and I can't really stop it at this point. So I do apologize if you're hearing that noise. And as a matter of fact, I think at this point I will call an end to today's program. We will continue discussing Israel-Palestine tomorrow with Medea, and why we must together unite for peace, for freedom for the Palestinian people, and against the Israeli genocide.